Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service historian stationed at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of Conservationists in Action. It's where we bring scientists, authors, professors out to talk about some of the latest issues in conservation, and tonight we actually have all three in one. Dr. Larry Nielsen, we're very fortunate. He's able to join us this evening. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to ask Dr. Nielsen some questions, and he's going to give me plausible answers to them. And we'll do this from 6 to 6:45, cover his distinguished career, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll have a public lecture from Larry about his newest book, Nature's Allies. So it's a rich evening. Sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and prepare to learn some interesting things about conservation, conservationists, fisheries, and a whole slew of other stuff. But first, let me give you a brief abstract. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
So just one thing to start with. Quit calling me Dr. Nielsen and start calling me Larry.
Fair enough. That'll speed things along. It's shorter. So let me introduce Larry very briefly, give an abstract of a very long, distinguished career, just so you know the type of expert you're listening to. He is Professor Emeritus of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Previously, he was Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor at North Carolina State University. Before that, he was Dean of the College of Natural Resources at NC State, Director of the School of Forest Resources at the Pennsylvania State University, and a faculty member and later head of the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences at Virginia Tech. Among his more than 100 publications that Larry has co-edited or authored, he's also done 3 textbooks on fisheries management. He is co-author with 3 others of a text called Ecosystem Management, an innovative textbook published in 2002. And his latest book, which we're going to talk about this evening, he's going to give a lecture on at 7 o'clock, is Nature's Allies, 8 Conservationists Who Changed Our World. I have a copy of it right here. It's a wonderful book. I greatly enjoyed reading it. And let me start off with your most recent book. You picked 8 individuals, John Muir, Ding Darling, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, Chico Mendes, Billy Frank Jr., Wangari Maathai, and Gro Harlem Brundtland. How did you pick these 8?
So it's an interesting process. So first of all, I wanted to have some people you would expect to be in the book, so that would, so if people picked up the book and they saw all names they didn't recognize, they would probably just put it down again. But if they saw John Muir and Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold, they might say, this will be interesting. But I also was determined not to have a book about old dead white guys. And so I wanted a book that had diversity in it, that had women as well as men, that had an international scope as well as just the United States. Now, the second criterion, though, is interesting because, people who've written definitive biographies of folks like Rachel Carson or Aldo Leopold, those books are hundreds of pages long, and they take 10 years perhaps to do the research to get it done. I knew I couldn't do that, so I had to pick people about whom other things had been written, who had a fairly large bibliography associated with them. And that determined part of my selection. So I had to have people who had also an interesting enough story that I thought that they would intrigue readers and such, but not too interesting. So, for example, I considered at one point the Gorillas in the Mist, Dian Fossey.
Oh, Dian Fossey, yeah.
Dian Fossey. I thought, well, that would be a good person. Well, I did a little bit of initial looking into her and turns out that she had a very interesting life, that she was considered somewhat of a homewrecker, and she was a hard drinking, hard smoking person. And, my wife said, "You're not putting that one in your book." So I left that out. And let me also say that when I started this project, I thought I would do 12 biographies. And when I had written 6, I thought I would do 10. And when I had written 8, I thought, that's enough.
I think we can all relate to that. You've been
let me tell you,
professor.
Mark, let me tell you one other interesting thing. So
Sure.
when I finished the book and sent it off to Island Press, it was about 86,000 words. And they came back and they said, we love the book, but it's too thick. And they said their marketing people know that a book that's this thick, people will probably pick up and read. But if it's this thick, they won't. And so they said, you have to cut out 10,000 words in order to make it short enough so that it would be attractive from a marketing standpoint. And so, not shorter.
So we don't have to worry about words. We have to worry about width. Basically, 1 inch good.
Yeah, it sits on the shelf like this, and people are going to see it. If it looks real big, not a chance unless you're Ken Follett. And my wife just finished Ken Follett, 900 pages. Wow.
Larry, were there any conservationists you left out for non-controversial reasons? Like that just didn't fit? If you'd been able to do 12, who would have been in there?
Well, that's another reason why I decided on 8, is because if you think about the criteria that I was using, it gets harder and harder to get people that are good subjects. And I didn't want to be too repetitive. So yes, I left out Gifford Pinchot and I left out Teddy Roosevelt, partially because, they're well known. And when you write the story of John Muir and Aldo Leopold, you've basically told the story of Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot. And I thought for a while about doing Sylvia Earle, who was the Blue Conservancy person. I forget exactly what the name is, but once again, I need someone to write a definitive biography of her for me to be able to abstract from that. And there are others. I could have used Jane Goodall. I'm sure there's plenty of information about her, but I used date, and I couldn't have fit any more in because it would be too thick.
Perfect. Well, you'll be happy to know by pure coincidence, 3 of your 8 are lodges at NCTC. We have a Ding Darling Lodge, we have an Aldo Leopold Lodge, and we have a Rachel Carson Lodge. The only one you missed was the Muirs, and there's 3 or 4 of them, so that would have been that would have blown up your width. Let me switch tracks a little bit. One of the things I like most that you've been publishing is a blog, Today in Conservation. Tell us a little about that, Larry.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And let me say that, first of all, it's not really an accident that Ding Darling and John Muir and your namesakes for your dormitories are in the book. I've slept in those dormitories many times doing training courses at NCTC, and I've kind of felt like, they were my brothers and sisters, so I was going to have them in there. And interestingly, today, so I changed my presentation a bit, and I'm going to cover Ding Darling in the presentation, which I usually don't, because today is Ding Darling's birthday, October 21st. which relates to the blog that I produced, or website as I call it. I don't know the difference. Called Today in Conservation. And so there is a website called todayinconservation.com, all one word, that lists, that contains a story from the history of conservation for every date of the year, all 366 of them. And that really was my project after writing Nature's Allies, was to compile that. And you can imagine when you write 366 stories, all, maybe 500, 600, 700 words, that's quite a task. It took me about 5 years probably to complete enough so that there's at least one story for every day of the year, every date of the year. And I did it as a way to give back to the conservation community. It's a free website and you can use it, and anybody is welcome to use it. The idea was that it would be available for teachers who want an interesting anecdote to start a class, who want a topic to build a day at the Nature Center around, students as a starting point for research. And so it's been great fun to do it. And I had a preliminary version of it, a website that I produced that was really horrible. And I hired a great professional, a fellow named Kevin Kennedy, to give it the functionality it needed and the look that it needed. And I'm really very pleased with it. And I hope people will use it. I've got to get the word out more. I haven't been doing that. I need to do that.
I go to it every day. I learned about the recent launching of the albatross, which goes back to our Fish Commission history and Ding Darling's birthday. That was a good reminder. I think we're all curious what happened on February 29th. I don't know if you recall on the leap year day.
So I was just going to say that, on some days of the dates in the year, not much happened in conservation. And you would guess for sure that February 29th is one of those. So on February 29th, I had a little bit of fun. My strategy of life and work is that if you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. Thank you, Stan Moberly. So on February 29th, I've got a piece about nature's great leapers.
I like that. That's perfect. All right, let me ask you about a different book than Nature's Allies. You were a co-author of a text on ecosystem management. That was the title. And it's been described as an innovative textbook. And I think we're curious, what was innovative about that, Larry?
Well, hang on while I get a copy.
Okay.
It's just right here on my shelf. So, yep, there's a copy of Ecosystem Management. I just peek around the back. That I wrote with Gary Mathai, who was with the Savannah River Ecology Lab, with Rick Knight, recently retired from Colorado State University, and Dennis Shenborn, who was a member of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in the Fisheries branch. Now, one of the things that was innovative is that it's a book about ecosystem management. And when we put it out in 2003, it may have actually been the first book, textbook style book about ecosystem management that existed. And incidentally, we based the book around our week-long short course that we did at NCTC and other places around the country for probably about 10 years. I think we did between 20 and 25 one-week short courses, working with Alan Temple and June McElwain. But there are some innovative features in it. For one, for example, there are a series of 3 scenarios of ecosystems that I made up and described both their natural features and their human features and the issues and such that can be used as a basis for discussion and problems, class assignments. And we have those class assignments examples that are included in the book, right in the book, for small assignments and large assignments. So it, it's okay. It's worked okay, I guess.
I remember that class out here. That was an excellent class. Might be the only class that
I ran into some political difficulties, of course, because we were teaching it at the time when ecosystem management went from being politically okay to say you were doing, and it hit a point where all of a sudden it was politically not okay to say you were doing ecosystem management. And so we stopped teaching the course, and it was replaced by this concept called community-based conservation, which largely is the same thing. But basically, our thought was ecosystem management is an extension of the concern about ecosystem from a small radius. So you would extend it in time, you would extend it in space, you would extend it in objects of interest. So that you got endangered species, you got things that were valuable as non-game species, rather than being worried about deer in a county of North Carolina for the next 2 years.
One of the other courses you taught was communication skills for the Forest Service for
Yes.
a couple of decades. And I wonder, why do you think it's important for public land stewards to be able to communicate better?
Well, you know as well as I do that, and I think Aldo Leopold was the one who said that, the animals and plants are easy, it's the people that are hard. But conservation, natural resource management surely depends on the will of the people and their willingness, their eagerness to become partners in the conservation effort. And so you don't do conservation by yourself. You do it in partnership with the people who live on the land, the people who make their livings from the land, the people who enjoy the land in one way or another, and get recreational value, spiritual value from it. Native Americans, for example, lots of different kinds of people. And so for natural resource managers to be able to effectively manage, they really have to be able to communicate well beyond their peers, beyond the jargon of their profession or the jargon of their agencies. One of the things we always talked about was you can't talk acronyms when you're speaking with the general public.
What other tips did you have for them to be more effective communicators?
Use short words and short sentences. Just like that.
Why is that? Well, that was a little demonstration.
Use short words.
You were talking earlier about community-based management and strategic planning. Explain a little more detail what community-based management is. You said it was similar to ecosystem management, but is it the same, or does it have a slightly different spin?
Well, I think that the whole concept, or what people, if you say ecosystem management to someone, they're going to come up with different answers. The old analogy about the blind men trying to describe an elephant based on touching it in different places on its body. And I think that was one of the reasons why ecosystem management turns off some people. It was interesting in the late 90s, in the mid 90s, I was on the second committee of scientists for the U.S. Forest Service in attempting to put together a new philosophy of management for the national forests. And there were about 13, there were 12 experts and me. And we got into arguments all the time, me mostly watching, but arguments all the time about, well, what is an ecosystem? Are people part of the ecosystem or are they not part of the ecosystem? And, I find those arguments rather, I'll use the word silly, because there's no question that in terms of natural resource management or sustainability, one has to include the human uses and the human values associated with the resource, or you're never going to get anywhere. So I think sometimes when people talk about ecosystem management, they think primarily in terms of the non-human parts of the ecosystem, the life history strategies and the habitat condition and those types of things. What the genetic makeup of a population is and such, all of which are important. But it's not going to get you anywhere unless you are working with the people on whose lands these plants and animals and habits live. And so if anything, community-based conservation to me is a much better term than ecosystem management.
Yeah, it implies people are part of the ecosystem. It kind of makes that stronger. That's great. Well, you also have done a heck of a lot on fisheries, and this coming up, as you well know, since you're the author of Today in Conservation, in 2021, we're totally excited to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Fish Commission and our agency. And you've had a long fisheries career. You've been president of the American Fisheries Society. You organized and co-chaired the first World Fisheries Congress in Athens, Greece. And I wonder, you've had such a long career, Larry, in spite of being so young. What challenges do you see today for fisheries? And this is really a two-part question. And how has fisheries management changed in your career?
So let me put a couple of caveats on this. First of all, I really stopped doing active research in fisheries in about 1990. And in fact, when I went back on the faculty in 2010, after being provost and dean at NC State, people wondered where I was going to start taking graduate students and that sort of thing. And I said, no, I'm not. Because, a 20-year administrative career moved me pretty far from the cutting edge of what's happening in research and such. So that's my caveat here, which is you should take what I say as a broad perspective of someone who has a lot of experience in natural resources and universities and education in general, but not the specifics. Incidentally, along with the 150th anniversary of the Fish Commission next year, it's also, we just passed the 150th anniversary of the American Fisheries Society. And we were supposed to have a great big history-based celebration this year, but because of COVID, everything's because of COVID this year, we delayed that until next year. So the American Fisheries Society will be celebrating in next September, late August, early September, simultaneously really with the Fish Commission and the eventual Fish and Wildlife Service, that history. And I'm actually scheduled to give a keynote address to talk about the changes that were occurring around 1870 in terms of how people thought about natural resources, thought about biological sciences, and as a preface for then talking about the history of the American Fisheries Society itself. And I'm really looking forward to doing that presentation and doing that work, because it was a really cool time between about 1850 and 1875 in terms of lots of changes. So that's an aside. That's the caveat. What do I think of has happened to fisheries and the challenges? Well, I can tell you one thing that's absolutely certain between when I was active and today, and that is the advent of genetic-based work and DNA markers, RNA markers, all that sort of stuff has unbelievably changed and radio telemetry being cheap and accessible and remote sampling of all kinds has changed the availability of data about fisheries tremendously. And I think we're going to be looking at in the coming years a very substantial sort of redefining and reimagining what we can know about fish populations, fish communities, and fisheries in general. I'll talk a little bit in my presentation when I talk about Billy Frank Jr. about those things. So that's one. Second is the importance of aquaculture. You mentioned I co-led the first World Fisheries Congress back in 1991, and about 4 years ago, we had, I think it was the 7th or 8th World Fisheries Congress. And I gave a keynote address at that, talking about what things were like 25 years earlier, 2024, actually, the way it worked out. And one of those is aquaculture. Aquaculture has become such a predominant part of fisheries management, and I believe in it very strongly. I said at that meeting that we eat salmon at my house once a week, and the only salmon that I buy is farm raised. And I got a lot of grief for that. About everybody from the United States who spoke afterwards said, no, I disagree with Larry Nielsen about this. But my position on it is that the fisheries resources of the world cannot possibly sustain the demands for food using wild catches. The population is going to continue to grow. The need for this protein is going to grow. It's good protein, but to try to do it on the basis of wild fisheries caught in nets and such it's not sustainable. So developments in aquaculture are essential to the future of the human protein food supply. And so I believe strongly in aquaculture. And I can tell you that in 1972 to 74, when I was doing my master's research on the freshwater shrimp, we all believed that there would never be shrimp culture. The life cycles were too complex that it just wouldn't happen. And now what? I don't know, I have the numbers in front of me. A huge portion of the shrimp that we consume worldwide is made in aquaculture. So it's a pretty interesting world.
Well, Larry, while you've been giving us a fascinating history of the origins of our agency and aquaculture, apparently the listeners got tired of my questions. They've come up with at least one of their own I'm going to share with you. Ellen Murphy has a comment. She says, Nature's Allies is terrific. Is there one of the conservationists that you regard as a more personal hero for you? And who do you think are the up-and-coming conservationists?
Well, thank you very much for that compliment. I'm glad you like Nature's Allies. So I'll answer this in two parts. So one is, who do I like most, maybe, of these 8 conservationists? Now, I have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. And if you ask me the question, which of my children do I like best, I'm not going to answer it. Or my grandchildren. I only have one wife, and I can tell you which wife I like best. But I will tell you, I think the person that I am most inspired by in the book is one I'll talk about tonight, who is Billy Frank Jr. I think his story is so compelling, and his personality was such an important part of this story happening and unraveling that I think it's just remarkable. Now, the person I probably identify with the most is Gro Harlem Brundtland. Incidentally, I don't want to correct you, Mark, but it's not Gro, it's Gro.
Thank you for correcting me.
So just think about the anti-hero in the movies with the minions, right? His name was Gru.
Oh yeah,
and that's the way you pronounce her name.
perfect.
She's probably the one I identify with most. I guess because in a very, very simple way, our careers, tracked somewhat the same direction. In mine in an insignificant way, hers in a very significant way. But I will tell you one thing about. Let me reach up on my bookshelf one more time. And show you this book, The Edge of the Sea by Rachel Carson. Yes. This was the book that got me. This was the book that hooked me when I was a young teenager, and I got it out of the library and read this book by Rachel Carson. And I said at that point, I want to be Rachel Carson. So I owe a big debt of gratitude to Rachel Carson for providing the inspiration that got me moving in this direction and kept me moving in it. And I would say that Rachel Carson is was the first person that I thought about writing the book. If we get to the question about, how long did it take you to write the book or whatever, we can talk about that. So, second part of the question: who are the up and coming conservationists that we might talk about for the future? And let me tell you that I have an idea for a new project that I'm just beginning to do the research on, which is so. It's great to write about these famous people that had big lives and presumably big impacts. But there are thousands of people out there who are committed to conservation or environmental sustainability in one way or another, and who do valuable work, good work all the time. They haven't had their life stories written. They haven't, we don't. They're not household names. So my next project that I want to do, and you talk about fantasies, right? This is my fantasy, that I'm going to travel around the world and interview and photograph about 50 people in various countries that are doing on the ground important work in conservation, but they're young or younger, and their lives stories haven't been told, and no one's made a feature movie about them. But I think by bringing those voices and those faces to conservation, it can be an inspiration for all of us, including people that come from diverse backgrounds and don't look like me necessarily. And that's my next project. And so I could read you off a name of some of the people that I'd like to include, but that's really not the important part. The important part is that I figure out a way to make that happen. Let me say one other thing about that. As I reflect on my website Today in Conservation, I went through and counted up the other day, and to my great disappointment, although I was trying, 90% of the people in the book are from developing countries, 90% are white, 75% are men. Did a little bit better with the gender split than the others. And the next round of people and events that I put into the conservation calendar, I want to be people from diverse backgrounds. Now I used sort of the strategies for searching for these people that I could use. But if you use conventional strategies, you're going to get conventional people. And so my job for the next 366 entries into this, and I don't intend ever to stop putting them in, will be to make this more diverse and more representative of the real face and voice of conservation, not only in the United States, but around the world. And
Well,
I think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should fund my around the world trip.
You're going to check later this week. Larry, this is a good segue, though. You talked about international conservationists, and you've worked around the world, from Republic of Georgia to the Czech Republic, South Africa, Costa Rica, England, and I wonder, seeing as you have such a great background in natural resource management and teaching it and so on, what differences do you notice when you travel internationally? What other countries are doing?
So we were talking about community-based conservation, and I would say that in general, when you go outside of the United States, by and large, you confront a situation where governments cannot isolate nature in wilderness areas or national parks of the kind that we have in the United States. Our version of national park is not replicated around the world very much at all. So I would say that a major difference between us and other places is that invariably, for different reasons in different places, but invariably, conservation needs to be practiced in collaboration with other uses of the land, whether it's for food production or wood production or water resources or hydroelectric facilities. I'd say the rest of the world does not have the luxury, and I don't use that in a pejorative way, the luxury that we have in the United States and maybe in Canada, for example, to have vast open spaces that have not been very densely inhabited and that we could and had the foresight to put away. So community-based conservation is absolutely essential in other places. And, I'm not going to speak about Chico Mendes tonight, the Brazilian rainforest advocate, and he got bumped in favor of Ding Darling. But when you read about conservation in South and Central America, what you read about and you see is that it always has to be practiced in a social, societal context, because just by itself, it's not going to go very far. But it has to have an element of bringing the lives of people along with it, improving the quality of life at the same time. And I would just offer another perspective, which is that I feel strongly that the enhancing the quality of life for the poorest people, the most disadvantaged people in the world, must go hand in hand with our protection of natural resources and our use of natural resources. Because if you don't do this, if they can't get together, the environment is eventually going to lose out. So we have to be bringing people along with the conservation message. And I wrote about Gro Harlem Brundtland in the book, and I won't talk about her tonight either. But she is the person who coined the definition of sustainability that we use today, and that live today so that people in the future, I'm paraphrasing, live today so that people in the future can live as they wish. But she recognized that quality of life, a sustainable environment, and public health were not three things, but just one thing. And that to me is crucially important. So.
That's great. All right, we're just about out of time, and I do want to hit you with two more questions because of your expertise. So the first one is, Larry, you were a great teacher. You won numerous awards and an impressive administrator. You mentioned, how long you've been a higher education administrator. You wrote a very well-received book called Provost. So I wonder what suggestions you have for higher education, maybe specifically as regards how we teach, say, natural resource management or ecology for higher education these days? I know you've thought deeply about this.
Yes. So it's always, what do I want to say? Winston Churchill is famous for saying, if he said man, but we'll say if a person age 21 is not a liberal, then she or he doesn't have a heart. And if when she or he's 40 is not a conservative, that person doesn't have a brain. Okay? And I sort of like that and sort of don't. But what I would say is if you're 60, or in my case, 72, and you're not liberal again, you don't have a soul. And it's because there are big issues and big problems associated with living in this world. And we've got to solve those. And my interest in education always, so the analogy to what Churchill said is that, so when a student goes to college, there is the introductory work that they do, which can be general. And then there's the stuff in the middle, all the technical things that you need to know. And then at the end, it should get general again. That is comprehensive in terms of, being about community-based conservation. And I have always believed that my strength and my importance was to be there at the beginning and at the end. And that I'm not the sort of technical person. My gosh, we need those people. We need the people who can run the models and who can collect the data and analyze the data and do the statistics and all of that sort of stuff. But for me, it is crucially important that people get started early and get started broadly in understanding what conservation is about. And that's why when I went back on the faculty in 2010, I said that I would take over this introductory course called Conservation of Natural Resources, that at the time we taught it one semester a year, had 100 students about. I built it to every semester and had 300 students in it, because I thought the message was so important. The need to get the conservation message out to everybody was crucial, and that I could do that. And I think in higher education, it's important to have your best teachers. Don't do it the way I did it. Put your best teachers in the beginning courses so that they can give students, energize students and convince them of what's important. And my goal as a teacher was, and I always told students this, was that I hoped 10 years down the road, when they had a job and a wife and a family and a house and were making decisions about how they were going to live their lives, that there may have been something that we talked about in our class together that would help them make an informed decision. I'm not going to tell them what they should decide, but that they would know the conservation message in broad context. And to me, that's what's important. Thank you.
I think that's great. So you are the bookends, basically. And just to clarify, that's the point to take out of the Churchill quote, not a political statement or anything. You're the generalist on at the beginning and end. And my last question is just, you've done so much with history, with your website and Nature's Allies. What do you hope younger people going into the field of conservation take out of these stories?
Well, I hope they find, for example, in Nature's Allies, that one, it's readable, and two, that they see themselves in some of these people, and that they see that, as Margaret Mead said, don't ever doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world, because indeed that's the only thing that ever has. I would say that, to be able to read these stories, to be a young woman in conservation and read the stories about Rachel Carson, and to be a young African American in our field and read about Wangari Maathai, to be a Native American and read about Billy Frank Jr. and say, I could be that person. That, I think, is remarkable. And that's what I wanted to achieve.
I think that's a great way to go out. So for those of you viewing, we're going to take about a 10-minute break, come back at 7 o'clock. And at 7 o'clock, Larry's going to present a couple of the conservationists from his book, Nature's Allies. So we'll take a quick coffee break here, let Larry stretch, and maybe pull some more books off his bookshelf. It seems voluminous. And then we'll see you. We'll see you all back at this same location in about 10 minutes. And if you have any questions for Larry, either from this conversation, from reading his books, or from his distinguished career, please put them in the comments section of wherever you're viewing us, and we'll get to all those questions in the next hour. So we'll see you in a little bit. Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the Conservation Lecture Series put on by the National Conservation Training Center and the Friends of NCTC. We just finished a wonderful discussion, question and answer with Larry Nielsen. And as you know, the Conservation Lecture Series brings you conservationists, authors, educators from around the world. And we actually combined all three tonight and Larry. So those of you that weren't with us for the previous hour, let me give you just a brief introduction to Larry. And then we'll go into his presentation. So Dr. Larry Nielsen is Professor Emeritus of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Previously, he was Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor at NC State University, and before that, he was Dean of the College of Natural Resources at NC State, Director of the School of Forest Resources at the Pennsylvania State University, and a faculty member and later head of the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences at Virginia Tech. Among more than 100 publications, he's co-edited and authored. He's written or co-authored 3 textbooks on fisheries management. He is co-author with 3 others of Ecosystem Management, an innovative textbook published in 2002, which has at least some of its roots in NCTC, which we're very proud of. And his latest book, the one he's going to talk to us about this evening, is Nature's Allies: 8 Conservationists Who Changed Our World. So we're very excited to have Larry with us here this evening. And I will turn it over to Larry with extreme gratitude for coming to do this virtual lecture for all of us. Oh, one last thing. If you have questions during Larry's talk, please place them in the comments section of wherever you're viewing this, and we will get to them at the end of his talk. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate a chance to be here with your NCTC colleagues and viewers from wherever you are. Thank you for spending some time with me this evening to talk about some of the great leaders in conservation and what their lives and what their work has meant for us. Now, I'm going to share my screen, which means that in a second you will not see me, good for you, and you will see my slides. And those will continue for about 42 minutes, and then we can talk again. I'll come back, bad for you, and we can have a discussion about some of the things that you're interested in. So bear with me for a second while I bring up what we want to make happen here. And here we go. So once again, thank you very much for being here. And I'd like to talk to you tonight about some lessons from the great conservationists of the past, some things from their lives that can inspire us to maybe become a great conservationist of the future. Now, there's one thing you need to know about me, and I guess only one, really, and thank you for that nice introduction, Mark, and that is that I am an optimist. I believe that today is better than yesterday, and that tomorrow will be better than today. And as proof of that, I will tell you that for 72 years, I have been a Chicago Cubs fan. And you cannot be a Chicago Cubs fan unless you're an optimist. But to prove that optimism is the right thing, let me note that after 108 years without a championship, the Chicago Cubs did win the World Championship in 2016. And I have great hopes for this year, but alas, it's going to be the Dodgers, I'm afraid. Anyway, I'm an optimist. I believe in a better future than we've seen in the past. Now, sometimes for people in conservation or with interests in conservation, it's hard to be an optimist. As Aldo Leopold said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And I acknowledge that the world is not the way it was 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. But what concerns me and what gives me hope is that the world is better today than it was 50 years ago, tremendously better. Just for an example, it was about 50 years ago, 51 years ago, that the Cuyahoga River, just as it flowed into Lake Erie by Cleveland, it burst into flames on June 26, 1969. It burst into flames because there was so much oil pollution on its surface that if someone dropped a match, the water would start on fire. Now, that wasn't the first time that it burst into flames. It had happened many times in the past, but alas, it was the last time. And if we look today, 50 years later, at the Cuyahoga River, the situation is much better. The water quality has improved. The fish population, the community is more diverse. Populations are coming back. Riparian areas are much greener and available for regular folks. And a few weeks ago, when I was giving a similar presentation, I said that, well, maybe it's not the place you want to go have your honeymoon, but it is much better than it was. And I got an angry, not angry, a call from one of my former students who said, "Hey, Cleveland is a great place to have your honeymoon." So you see, you wouldn't have done that in 1969, but you can do it today. And I would argue that there are many, many things we can talk about and point to in conservation, but I'm not going to, most of you could give these answers better than I could, so we'll not do that. But let me just say that as a strategy for talking to students and others about conservation and the environment and the possibilities of the future, I wrote the book Nature's Allies, 8 Conservationists Who Changed Our World. And the idea there was to talk about 8 people who, by their work and their careers and their lives, had brought about very positive differences in the way we protect and manage our natural resources. And those 8 people are pictured here. And some of them you recognize, of course, from the upper left, John Muir, Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, and in the bottom left, maybe Ding Darling. But others you might not recognize. Next to Aldo Leopold is Wangari Maathai, and below her, Chico Mendes, and next to him, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and finally, Billy Frank Jr. Now, these are people from all different walks of life. And as I was writing the book and researching it, I was always had in the back of my mind, what is it that these people had in common that caused them to be such great conservationists? Were they all scientists? Were they all educated? Did they all come from good families? Did they, what really did they have in common? And it wasn't any of those things I just mentioned, but I did deduce three characteristics of these folks that I think are true for each one of them and true for us as we think about the future of conservation. Number one is passion. These people had a commitment to make the world a better place, and they threw themselves into that commitment with all their passion, with all their energy, with all their capability. But we all know that passion can burn white hot for a while and then burn out. All you have to do is look at the cover of those newspapers at the checkout at the grocery store to realize that it doesn't last forever. So the second characteristic is persistence. These folks that I'm going to talk about tonight and that I wrote about in the book never let themselves stop working for sustainability, for a better future for the people and the earth. And third, in most cases, they used partnerships to advance the causes that they cared about. you can do a lot by yourself, but you can do so much more when you work in partnership with others. Now, I would love to speak with you about all 8 of these people tonight, but we don't have time to do that. And of course, you need to read the book. You need to buy the book. I do care if you read it, but I really care if you buy it, because my retirement is depending on you buying this book. Thank you very much. But I would like to spend a few minutes talking about 3 of these extraordinary people: Ding Darling in the bottom left, then Billy Frank Jr. next to him, and finally Wangari Maathai, the lady in the upper right-hand corner. And show you the passion, the persistence, the partnerships that led them to become the icons of conservation that we know about. So let's begin with Ding Darling. Ding Darling was a editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines newspaper, who became truly a leader in conservation. And today, I often don't talk about Ding Darling, but today I am, because today is a special day. It is, in fact, Ding Darling's birthday, October 21st, 1876. And while we're on this slide, I want to mention to you that I have produced a website called Today in Conservation that you can look at every day. And it has a story about something that's happened in the history of conservation on every date of the year, all 366 days. And if you're a teacher, I hope you'll use them. If you're a student, I hope you'll use them. And if you just like to see what's gone on in the past in conservation, please visit Today in Conservation. Well, Ding Darling grew up in the far northwestern corner of the state of Iowa, born in 1876. And he was really a child of the wide open plains. He loved to hunt. He loved to fish, to ride horses. He was quite an explorer and adventurer in his own way. He wasn't, and he loved to draw, and he could make people love him for his drawings, and he could also make people quite upset by his drawings. And in fact, he got kicked out of one of the colleges that he went to for drawing this caricature of the president of the university doing a Scottish Highland fling that was in the school yearbook. And most people liked his drawings, but apparently the president of the university didn't. And I was a provost, and which is close to being a president, and I can tell you, most of the presidents I know wouldn't have enjoyed that either, but us provosts would have. Well, Ding Darling's name was J. Norwood Darling, but he adopted the nickname of Ding, which was short for Darling, as a way to have what he thought was a cool moniker, and also to hide his true identity from the people he drew. That didn't work very well. But it did help him along in a career to become one of the United States' most important and well-known editorial cartoonists of the first half of the 20th century. He drew an editorial cartoon virtually every day for 50 years that appeared first in the Des Moines newspaper and then became syndicated around the world. And in those days, the editorial cartoons weren't buried deep in the newspaper, but they were on the front page. It was a way that people could get a picture of what was going on in the news right away by looking at the front page. And here you see a picture of an editorial cartoon that he drew when President Franklin Roosevelt won. And we'll talk about Darling and Roosevelt in a few minutes. But as much as Ding Darling loved cartooning, he loved something else more, and that was conservation. He was an ardent conservationist his whole life, an ardent hunter, a believer in protecting land, protecting resources. And he would often draw and slip in an editorial cartoon on the front page of the paper that dealt with conservation. Here's one, for example. He was quite worried about the growth of the world's population and the ability of Mother Nature, you see down there by the cook stove, being able to feed this growing population that had an insatiable appetite for food. And you'll notice the stovepipe leading up from the stove there that says it's the world's tillable soil. He was also very concerned about the fertility and the condition of the soil as a precursor to wildlife management, to farming, towards all the things that are necessary for life. He also was strongly concerned about waterfowl. You know, in the era between 1920 and 1940, waterfowl populations in the United States were declining precipitously. One, because of over-harvest, as you can see here, and also because of the loss of habitat. And this was a cartoon that he wrote showing the idyllic situation in 1920, the extraordinary overhunting in the 30s, and then what he anticipated would be another extinct species to go along with the dodo bird very soon. Now, Ding Darling was a lifelong Republican, and unlike most people, and unlike the historical perspective, he loved Herbert Hoover. He thought he was a great man who got blamed for something that wasn't his doing in the Great Depression, and was very reverent about Hoover and the work that he did after World War I, bringing food relief to Europe in the wake of that devastating war. He liked Hoover very much, and they were close friends throughout both of their lives. Now, unlike most people, he detested Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ding Darling thought he was a megalomaniac, someone who was destined to squash the American spirit of entrepreneurism because of the New Deal programs that were creating what he thought would be a welfare state. And you know what? Roosevelt didn't care much for Ding Darling either, because he was a constant thorn in his side about the conservation message. Darling thought that the way the precursor to the Fish and Wildlife Service was doing its work was terrible, and he wrote to Roosevelt constantly about what they should do and how they should do it, and Roosevelt finally had enough. And one day he called Ding Darling on the phone, and Darling picked it up, and it was the president on the other end. And Roosevelt said, "If you don't like the way we're doing things, why don't you come in here to Washington and fix it?" Well, it was unimaginable that Roosevelt would ask or Darling would agree, but he did. He agreed that he would come in and become chief of what was then the U.S. Department of Bureau of the Biological Survey in the Department of Agriculture. And for 20 months, during 1934 to 1936, he served as what we now call the chief of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he had an extraordinary impact on the condition of resources in the United States. Now, I have to tell you that one of the things he worked on was the duck stamp. As Darling came into office, the duck stamp had just been passed by Congress, and it was his job to implement the duck stamp program. And one of the first things he had to do was figure out what a duck stamp would look like. And one day his boss came in, the Undersecretary of Agriculture, and said, "Hey, Darling, we need to start talking about and thinking about what this duck stamp would look like." Now, most high-level executives in Washington, D.C. and other places used to keep a supply of starched shirts in their desk drawer in case they had to change for an evening event. And all of those shirts had inside them a shirt cardboard that held them neatly in place. So Darling pulled out a shirt from inside his his drawer, pulled out the shirt cardboard, and quickly sketched something and said, "How does this look?" as the first stamp. And in fact, that became the image that was engraved on the first duck stamp in 1934, 1935. And here it is. And that was the beginning of the duck stamp. And we all know how important duck stamps have become through time. At that point, it cost $1. And in the first year, there were 600,000 of them. Now there are many millions. Here's here's Ding Darling getting a page of stamps at the first printing from the Postmaster General of the United States. Today, the duck stamp looks like this, and it costs $25, not $1. But it has been an extraordinary success based on the implementation of it by Ding Darling. It's produced more than $800 million to buy and maintain wildlife refuges, and it's been copied all over the United States and all over the world as an extraordinary way to fund wildlife management. Now, he also thought that the wildlife refuge system needed a lot of attention. There were, the first wildlife refuge started in 1903, but there were a few that had come in the intervening 3 decades, but they weren't well taken care of. They weren't maintained. They weren't run. And there needed to be a lot more. And so Darling hired a fella, John Salyer II, who he knew from the state of Iowa, to go out and survey the country and find out where the refuges should be and acquire the land. And during the 20 months that they were together, they acquired the land for 55 wildlife refuges covering 5 million acres. And John Salyer continued in that role for 27 years and is rightly called the father of the National Wildlife Refuge System, brought in and nurtured by Ding Darling. And today, as you know, there are, I checked just today, 568 national wildlife refuges that cover 95 million acres. And before you Fish and Wildlife Service people tell me it's 150 million acres, that I know includes the marine reserves and other things that are managed by the system, but aren't strictly wildlife refuges. It's an extraordinary outcome from a man who didn't want to be part of the government, but his passion required him to take the opportunity when it came to him. And today, he's known as the best friend a duck ever had, and a best friend for those of us who love ducks. Well, let's talk about the second person now, Billy Frank Jr. Billy Frank Jr. was a Native American salmon fisherman from Northwest Washington. He lived from the 30s up until just a few years ago. And his story is also one that is truly inspirational. Now, Billy Frank Jr. was a member of the Nisqually people, one of about 20 Native American groups in Western Washington that are still recognized today. Now, we have to go back about 150 years to get the beginning of this story. When the United States was wanting to bring people to Western Washington, they had a program to give land to the settlers. We've done that many times in our country. But the first thing they had to do was to sign treaties with the Native Americans so that it was legal for the federal government to own the land and then give it to settlers. And the first of those treaties for Western Washington was signed the day of and the day after Christmas in 1854 at a place along the Nisqually River called Medicine Creek under what was called the Treaty Tree. And that treaty was signed with the Nisqually and 2 other groups, was like most of the other treaties that have been done in the United States, in which the federal government basically robbed the Native American groups of most of their land and most of their rights. But there was one clause in this treaty that has turned out to be extraordinarily important. And that clause was this, that the Native Americans retained the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations forever. It meant they could fish where they had always fished, whether it was on the reservation or not. They could use whatever techniques they wanted, and they could catch as many fish as they wanted and use them in any way they wished, whether they wanted to keep them for themselves or sell them as they had been doing. Well, for a century, no one really cared. Fish catches weren't that high. The situation didn't really demand a lot of attention. And this is a picture of some of the the original ways that they fished, putting up weirs to stop fish migrating upstream on the way to spawn. But after World War II, a century after that treaty was signed, things started to change. And the hero in our story from now on is Billy Frank Jr., the man standing in the back of the boat with the gill net. After World War II, the condition of the salmon populations was going down precipitously. Fish catches went down for lots of reasons. There was overfishing. There were dams being built on the rivers that stopped migration both up and down. There was pollution from industrial sources and also logging that went right to the edge of the streams and rivers, causing sedimentation and high temperatures. The fish populations were in bad shape. Someone had to take the blame for this. And guess who got the blame? Well, of course, it was the Native American fishermen. At the time, in the post-war years, the Native American fishermen were taking about 5% of the total catch. But they were the ones who got the blame for the decline in the fish populations. And the place where the confrontations tended to focus was on a place on the Nisqually River called Frank's Landing, a place where Billy Frank Jr.'s grandparents and parents and he and his family had been landing fish, processing fish, selling fish, and other things for generations. It was the white-hot center for the issues surrounding the controversy between the fish and game people in the state of Washington and the Native Americans who were saying that they were doing only what their treaty allowed them to do. And as we get into the 1960s, things got more and more intense. The law enforcement got more violent and more extreme. Here you see agents from the Washington Fish and Game Department pulling an Indian gill net up out of the water. They would often do this. They would confiscate the nets, confiscate the fish, confiscate the boat if they could get it, and arrest the fishermen. Billy Frank Jr. was first arrested when he was 14 years old when he was caught fishing, and about 50 more times over the course of his life. It became so routine that if Billy Frank Jr. had gone out fishing in the morning or overnight and didn't come home for supper, his wife would simply find something in the house that could be pawned, give it to one of their sons who'd take it to the pawn shop, get some cash, take that to bail his father out of jail. It became extraordinarily routine. And it involved many people, but Billy Frank Jr., and that you see in this red circle, was an exceptional participant in all this because he had a personality that differed from, just about everybody's. He loved people, and it didn't matter whether you were his friend or you were trying to arrest him. He treated you with respect and like a friend. He would give you a smile, a firm handshake, and often a hug if he could. He was a natural diplomat. And as a consequence, he became a spokesperson for the issue of Native American treaties and became the person who was often at the forefront, not just at forefront of these issues, not just on the riverbank or getting arrested. Now, as it gets to the late 1960s and early 1970, the situation becomes more and more dire and more extreme. And in this figure, you can see in the bottom left, Maisel Bridges, one of Billy Frank Jr.'s cousins, clinging to her gill net as the conservation officers were dragging it and her and another woman who was behind her out of the water so that they could confiscate the nests and arrest the women. It was getting really bad. Now, this is also the time that social unrest was at a high fever pitch in the United States. Young people everywhere were protesting about the war in Vietnam, about civil rights, about women's rights, about rights to do whatever you want with your personal life. And the issue of Indian rights and Indian treaty rights became part of this national movement. And so it attracted a lot of attention. And with the help of others, Billy Frank Jr.'s cause was on the front page of the newspaper, it was on the radio, it was on the TV news, and it became a bigger and bigger issue. And then it came to head in September of 1970 when a protest near where the Nisqually River came out near Olympia, Washington, got really out of hand. A bridge was burned, as you can see here. Shots were fired, tear gas was used, and 60 people were arrested during this confrontation. And at that point, on that day, the U.S. attorney for the western portion of Washington state said, enough. And a couple weeks later, when he got his ducks in line, he had the U.S. government sue the state of Washington for the abrogation of the native treaty fishing rights. Now, this case was given to a fellow named Hugo Bolt, a judge, and many of you will know about the Bolt decision. But for 4 years of legal wrangling and taking testimony and such, Hugo Bolt listened to the arguments, and he listened to Billy Frank Jr., who was always there, always persistent, always passionate, always working to make sure that the perspective of the Native American fishermen and the Native Americans in general was understood. In 1974, early in 1974, Judge Bolt issued his finding, and he had three findings in his decision. One is that the Indians' rights, treaty rights for fishing had been violated and have been violated for a century. Now, the second thing was that people expected that he would assign some of the fish catch to belong to the Native Americans. Like I said earlier, they were catching 5% of the fish. And so they expected that he would give the Native Americans 5% of the catch. He did not. He assigned half the fish catch to the Native Americans, reasoning that they were one sovereign nation and the United States of America was another sovereign nation, and each of them should get half of the catch. Well, as you can imagine, this was not appreciated by the traditional fishermen. This picture shows Judge Bolt being hoisted and hung and later burned in effigy on the lawn of the federal courthouse in Olympia, Washington. And you can see what some of the fishermen wrote on their boats about this situation. It wasn't liked, and it was appealed several times, but always upheld by the Supreme Court. Now, the most important of the three things that Judge Bolt said was this, the third, and that is from now on, the Native Americans and the state and federal government would manage these fisheries collaboratively, that it wasn't just the state and the federal government that got to make the regulations and decide what was what, but it had to be done collectively, collaboratively, and all parties had to agree to what the fish management was going to be. And this indeed, folks, led to a new era of fisheries management. Because now, well, and guess who was in the middle of it? Billy Frank Jr. He helped form what the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which is the official body that manages these fisheries on behalf of the Native American communities in northwestern Washington. He became the leader of that commission for almost all of the rest of his life, except for a short interval. He became the official fish manager for the tribes. And now you see what happened is that because this now had to happen in collaboration between two entities, that all of the work had to become transparent and explicit. And out of that developed all of the things that we now use and know about fisheries management. Recruitment models, population models, real-time harvesting, genetic analysis, all of those things have their roots in the reality that Native Americans and state and federal officials had to get together, share the information, and come up with common strategies for seasons, for takes, for annual allowable harvest, all of those things. And always in the middle of it, as he had been on the riverbank, as he had been in the legal case, and as he was now in the management of the fisheries, was Billy Frank Jr. He made this extraordinary transition because of his commitment, his personality, and his persistence, from being the getting arrested guy, as he liked to call himself, to becoming the international ambassador for salmon. He became a friend and colleague and advisor to 7 presidents. He negotiated partnerships with state agencies, with the federal government, with the government of Canada and Japan, to have this entire Pacific management plan for salmon. He worked with timber companies and power companies and the U.S. Army to manage the resources collaboratively to make sure salmon had a chance to be sustainable. And that led to some of the highest recognitions that you could imagine. Wildlife Refuge, that includes on its edge the place where the treaty tree once stood and where the treaty was signed, is now the Billy Frank Jr. National Wildlife Refuge. And he received the National Medal of Freedom posthumously from President Obama a few years ago. And because of the work of Billy Frank Jr. being persistent in making sure that salmon were protected, our salmon populations are now well managed and recovering to the point where there's enough for commercial fishermen, there's enough for Native American fishermen, for recreational fishermen, and even for the famous brown bears of Katmai National Park. Okay, let's go halfway around the world to the country of Kenya in East Africa. And I'll tell you about our last person, our last conservationist, Wangari Maathai. Wangari Maathai was a Kenyan woman who did something truly extraordinary that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Well, she was born in the 1930s and liked to call herself a child of the soil. She was born into a subsistence village where they had small farms that provided people with a healthy, nutritious diet. People were well fed, they were happy, they had a pleasant environment. And it was perhaps not idyllic, but she loved it and the people were very happy. Now, Wangari Maathai turned out to be a very lucky young girl in Africa, because at the time, girls didn't go to school. But one day when her mother was putting her brothers, getting them ready to go to school, one of her brothers said, "Mom, why doesn't Wangari go to school like we do?" And her mother didn't have a good answer for that question. So she said, "Wangari, put your shoes on, you're going to school." And Wangari Maathai went to school and she never stopped. She was an excellent student in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, and was fortunate enough to go to the United States and get a biology degree from St. Scholastica College for Women in Kansas. And here you see her in one of her classes in her dormitory. And then on to the University of Pittsburgh to get a master's degree in biology and great skills using electron microscopy. Now, because at this time, in the mid-1960s, Kenya had become independent and needed native Kenyans to take on important positions, she went back to Kenya and took a position as an assistant professor of veterinary medicine at the University of Nairobi. One of her jobs there was to go out in the country and survey the condition of cattle for diseases and nutrition. And when she went out into the countryside where she had grown up, she was distraught by what she found there. Because in place of the subsistence farms and the small woodlots that were there were now huge commercial plantations of tea and loblolly pines. And the people, instead of growing their own food, were getting small salaries and going to the store and buying food at exorbitant prices. The environment that she grew up in, that was so lush and water plentiful, was now dry and bare. Women had to walk hours in order to get enough water for the day. And likewise, the woodlots were gone and the wood supply was gone, and women had to walk hours to get the wood needed to cook their food and to warm their homes during the colder parts of the year. Instead of being well-nourished and happy people, what Wangari Maathai found were people that were poor, were malnourished, and were dispirited with their condition of their life. And Wangari Maathai said, I have to do something about this. I must commit myself to change this situation. And for a while, she didn't know what to do. And then, as she said, it hit me all of a sudden, why not plant trees? Why not help the women of Kenya relearn how to grow trees and to help reforest the country? And so she did. She began a program of meeting with small groups of rural women in village after village in Kenya to teach them and to help them create nurseries where they could grow trees and then plant them out into the landscape, trees that would mature in a few years and produce fruits and produce wood that they could use, produce shade and better soils. And she did this with group after group after group around the country. And with that, her fame through grassroots grew and grew and grew. And as she performed this work over many years, she realized that there were other things that she needed to pay attention to. And she became a crusader for not only the trees, but for the environment in general, and for the rights of the people of Kenya to live in a self-determining democracy. And here you can see a picture where she is going to protest the theft of a public forest given to a rich landowner by the president of the country. And you can see that she's going to protest, and he has armed guards standing there ready to threaten and perhaps injure Wangari Maathai. She was never deterred. Her passion was never deterred. She was not about to stop. She said, the more you challenge me, the tougher I get. My hide is like that of an elephant. Now, she continued this work, and things got worse and worse and worse for her. At first, she was considered a nuisance, and no one thought she'd have much impact. But she did, and then she became a problem, and eventually became considered to be an enemy of the state, and had to live underground, figuratively, moving from house to house among her friends to stay ahead of the police and assassination attempts. She was arrested many times. She was beaten many times. At one point, she was beaten over the head, and her head was bleeding, and she had to sign her arrest warrant, and she reached up and put her finger into the blood and signed her name with her own blood. Here's a picture of her being taken out of prison, where she had been locked up for 2 weeks in a damp, cold, dark cell that had made her arthritis so bad she thought she might never walk again. But as she left the hospital in a friend's car, she saw banners on the street that said, "Wangari, you will never walk alone." And she took that inspiration and continued her work, continuing to teach women throughout Kenya and other countries how they could grow trees, how they could become more self-sufficient, more self-confident, and take a role in the management of their own communities and their own lives. And she did something, as I said, that was truly extraordinary. In collaboration and partnership with these groups, she planted 50 million trees in Kenya. 50 million. And tens of millions in countries adjacent to Kenya that were never counted. 50 million trees, while being pursued as an enemy of the state. And her activity became known as the Green Belt Movement. And if you go to Uhuru Park, like the Central Park of Nairobi, Kenya, you can see in one corner of the park this sign in a place called Freedom Corner that was put up to recognize her efforts to regrow trees, to reforest the country of Kenya, and to encourage us never to forget the work that she had done. And of course, we haven't forgotten that work, and the world didn't forget that work, because in 2004, Wangari Maathai received a small award, the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize. The first Peace Prize given in recognition of the fact that a peaceful world, one without war and strife, is only possible if there is a sustainable environment for that world to live in. And I love the story about the day she heard that she had won the prize. She was riding in a car on her way to a hotel, a local hotel in Kenya, to perform an event. When she got there, the news had gotten to the hotel before she did. And all the people were out front as she pulled up and got out of the car, and they were clapping and yelling. And one of them said, "Wangari, how can we help you celebrate, acknowledge this wonderful recognition that you got?" And she said, "How about you bring me a shovel and we plant a tree?" 50 million and one. An extraordinary person doing extraordinary things. Well, those are the three stories I wanted to tell you tonight about Ding Darling and Billy Frank Jr. and Wangari Maathai. And I wish I could tell you the stories of all these people. We don't have time. And of course, I want you to buy the book. But remember the three lessons of their lives and commit yourself to use your passion to make the world a better place, and to not give up when it doesn't work the first time, but to persist and come back over and over again, and to find partners, either ones you know or new ones that you can make, that will help you and help us along on this path. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the next time someone wrote a book about conservationists that changed the world, they didn't highlight just 8 people, but they highlighted 9. And the 9th one was you. Thank you very much for your attention. And let me see if I can stop sharing my video and get back to Mark and the other website.
Okay, are we back? Did you hear anything? Great. We had a question. I apologize for the technical difficulties. This is part of uh, living with COVID. But Larry, you in the comments from Facebook and the live stream, a lot of people reacted to your book and your presentation, and I wonder what type of reaction you've gotten to your book. Have people like you found connections or inspiration, or what type of feedback have you gotten on the book?
Uh, well, most of the reviews that have come in on Amazon and other places have been very good. Some people have said they thought it was a little dry. Some thought it was almost like hero worship. But in general, I think people like it. Of course, most people who don't like something don't tell you. So, I don't know. I'm sure there are people who thought I was wrong about people. I'll tell you one thing that was interesting. I've gone around the country doing lectures based on the book, and I was quite concerned when I got out to the Pacific Northwest. I did a series at the University of Washington and Oregon State and Western Washington University, and I was hoping that my perspective on Billy Frank Jr. was in fact the one that they had out there. And I was very pleased to see that, yes, indeed, people thought that I had gotten it right.
Now, Larry, we have all three of those people you talked about as conservation heroes at NCTC, and we're very happy about that. But they seem very disparate. And besides passion, persistence, and partnerships, of the 8 people you looked at, were there any other surprising connections between them?
Well, one of the things that I've found interesting throughout my life is that the state of Iowa tends to produce a lot of great conservationists. Aldo Leopold was from Iowa. Ding Darling was from Iowa. Norman Borlaug, who I consider to be a great conservationist, and we could talk about that as well, was from Iowa. Lots of people from Iowa, and I don't know why that is, but a strong connection there. No, well, let me say first of all that 7 of the 8 people that I profiled are amateurs. So certainly what would connect them is the fact that they found a need and found a way to support that need, and it wasn't their job to do so. The only one I consider a professional in regard to the book was Aldo Leopold. Now you might question, well, Rachel Carson was a fish biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but she wrote her first 2 books about the sea, and the second one was so successful, and she made so much money from it that she could quit the Fish and Wildlife Service. And she said she was never so happy as the day she quit working for the government. I apologize for that sentiment.
Yeah, we were taking offense there.
What she's known for really is, in general, is Silent Spring, which is something she wrote well after she was not a professional and really didn't relate to the things she did professionally. So I really believe that this passionate commitment to making the world better is really what these people draws them together.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question from one of the viewers. Justin McClure wanted to know, Larry, what do you think the future of ecosystem management looks like, particularly in urban and suburban environments?
Thank you for that question, Justin. Well, let me say that I think the future for environmental management, which in urban environments is really another way to say ecosystem management, I think is very bright. I truly am optimistic about the future. I think the way, for example, that opinions about climate change have changed in the last decade is extraordinary. And I think that as more and more people live in cities, they're going to find ways and find needs to work with nature and with the environment to make a better environment. And you may know the name Stephen Kellert, who is very much into eco-design. That was an old friend of mine that died, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. But I think those ideas to bring nature into the city, to find ways to humanize the environment is going to be a big part of what we do. And I would argue that the conservation message and the conservation future needs to include in its core our interests in the urban environment. It's not all about the wonderful wilderness areas and refuges and national parks that we have, but it's about the spaces, the green spaces and the urban environments that we can create that will make a difference in people's lives. So I'm up for it.
Hey, we're just about out of time. And one question that came up a couple times is people really found your talk inspiring. They greatly enjoyed this, Larry, and they wanted to know how other people would view it. And you'll actually be able to view it on Facebook in the future, and we'll put in the comments other means you might be able to view it. So have no fear, this will not disappear. And then a hearty thank you to Larry. You've been with us for 2 hours on an evening, cutting into your free time. But we really enjoyed this presentation. I personally found it inspiring and learned a lot as the historian of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I never would have thought there were so many connections between, say, Ding Darling and Wangari Maathai. So thank you for inspiring us, for teaching us something new, and for giving us a wonderful conservation lecture series.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. And let me say that for people that might be still listening, once this COVID is up, I intend to go back on the road and talk about this. So if you have an interest in having me show up at some time, I would be delighted to do it. It's one of the ways my wife and I like to travel around and meet people and make the conservation message. And I'm retired now, which means that all my time is free time, Mark. No problem.
Sounds good, Larry. We've got 5 more stories we need to hear from you about the rest of your book. So hopefully we'll get you out to NCTC in person very, very soon. So thank you. And thanks to all the viewers who took the time to tune in. We very much appreciate it. And we'll see you in November when we'll be talking about wildlife cams like eagle cams and so on. Until then, enjoy your evening.